8 weeks, 57 days. That's how long Donkey Kong Bonanza was on the market before Nintendo decided to roll out paid DLC and a demo. Is this part of a coordinated strategy or signs of a panic behind the scenes at Nintendo? Let's get into it. First up, we should note that in the recent history of Nintendo releases, this is extremely unusual. Nintendo has had the odd game with an expansion pass where there have been elements dropped day one and in the weeks after launch, but often DLC is released between 12 and 18 months after a game launches. This was the case with Splatoon 2, Splatoon 3, and Animal Crossing New Horizons. Some games have a shorter window. The Xenoblade games notably get their expansions around 6 to 9 months after the initial release, while Breath of the Wild put its DLC to bed fully in early December with the second wave, The Champion's Ballad. And there is one very curious example of a game getting a fairly significant, although not paid, DLC very quickly. A little game by the same development team called Super Mario Odyssey. Even here, though, Luigi's Balloon World was added as a free expansion and was small in scale and was dropped in February 2018, a little over 5 months and one complete holiday season after Super Mario Odyssey launched. Why would Nintendo launch DLC so early and with a demo to boot? My first thought was that this might be a response to poor initial sales. I'd like to shout out and quote XLM905 in the comments of a previous video, who said, "I think it might not quite have hit the sales highs they hoped for. I release software products for a living, and if my product hadn't hit the usage or sales I hoped for, a demo or a post-release remarketing push is exactly what I do. The sunk cost fallacy does not apply so quickly with software. Development is by far and away your largest cost. Marketing is cheap, so you squeeze return on your investment." End quote. This is an excellent contribution, which I think resonates with my initial impressions as well, and I think this certainly does ring true as one possible explanation for Nintendo's strategy here. Having said that, I don't necessarily think that it's the whole story either. EPD8 are good, but they're not that good that I think they can whip up a whole new area from scratch in a couple of months from commission to testing. My guess is that the Bananza DLC was always planned. It feels likely that there was some early decision to break this away from the original game. The layer is reminiscent in structure to the Super Mario Odyssey post-game in the Mushroom Kingdom, which could also probably have coped on its own as DLC and is similar in size and scope to Donkey Kong Island, at least as I recall it. And of course, the new mode with Void Kong is very similar in many respects to Balloon World in that it uses the existing locations for new purposes. It's also notable that as paid DLC goes, this is far cheaper than Nintendo Standard, $25 for Animal Crossing, Splatoon, Fire Emblem, Mario Kart, and $30 for Xenoblade DLC has been standard on the original Switch. So for Nintendo, $20 for a Donkey Kong DLC on the Switch 2 is clearly positioned as a low-cost expansion compared to others they may wish to do in future. That signifies either that they had more ambitious plans that were cut short, or that they always saw this as a very limited expansion. And this can make sense in a certain way. EPD8 are a team in huge demand. Not only are we expecting from them a major new Rock the Foundation's Mario title in the Switch 2 generation, but they are also now carrying the torch for 3D Donkey Kong. If and when DK gets a movie, it will be even more imperative that the Takahashi-led branch team who developed Donkey Kong Bonanza are well into work on more Donkey Kong action. Having them drag their heels developing a long DLC project is risky. Here's the paradox about DLC. As a proposition for the customer, it is almost always far worse value than the original title. For the publisher, it is usually a relatively small amount of work compared to developing a whole new game, for sometimes 30, 40, 50%, in the case of Smash more than 90%, the original sticker price, and because it will be a digital transaction, it is even more beneficial for Nintendo, especially as the publisher, since they pocket the retailer cut as well. However, that only works if a lot of people buy the DLC. In very crude terms, let's take New Horizons. Assume for the sake of argument that the original Animal Crossing New Horizons team was together for 7.5 years, and the development of the spin-off took 1.5 years, and that the number of staff and the overall cost of the project were broadly consistent throughout the development of both the original game and the DLC. This isn't very realistic to the way game development would work, but my only point from this is that we could estimate, therefore, that the budget for Happy Home Designer would be about 20% of that of New Horizons. Now, if 100% of people buy the DLC either directly or through deciding to sign up to the expansion pack, then when you adjust the missing retailer cut, you would probably find, therefore, that it made 50% of the original game outright, making it 2.5 times as profitable as the original title. Therefore, if 40% of people buy the DLC, it would be similarly profitable as the original game, which is a pretty good deal when you've sold as many as Animal Crossing New Horizons did. The really risky situation, though, is when you have DLC which significantly underperforms. Why would it underperform? Well, perhaps the game just isn't very well recognized now. They could bring out Mario Kart 8 Deluxe DLC 5 years after the game first launched and 8 years after the original title because, well, it's Mario Kart 8, the juggernaut bestseller of 2 consecutive Nintendo home consoles. They can also afford to bring out late-in-life DLC for the likes of Kirby and the Forgotten Land or Super Mario Bros. Wonder because they then get to sell these games on Switch 2 as new for the foreseeable future. These are evergreens that they can expect to last the entire generation and still do well. But Donkey Kong is a relatively niche franchise these days, despite the fact that in the past he has been pretty successful, and Bananza is still ultimately a quite experimental title with a game mechanic which is pretty new. They therefore need to capitalize on it now before the lens of publicity moves, as it surely will over the next 2 years, to Mario and Zelda, those franchises of the massive cinematic experiences. Add to this that Donkey Kong Bonanza was probably, for Nintendo's taste, underpriced at launch. Obviously, the public perception of the $80 price tag for Mario Kart World was utterly toxic, but from Nintendo's point of view, they obviously feel that this price tag reflects the endeavours and the potential of the game to continue to entertain for potentially a decade to come. Now, Donkey Kong Bonanza is a game that clearly had similarly lavish attention paid to it, but its price was less. Partly, I suspect, this is because the game doesn't have the long-tail longevity of Mario Kart World, and so it might be more obvious that it's not worth the price to your average consumer who would continue to play Mario Kart World for potentially years, but might find Donkey Kong Bonanza lying on a shelf after a few months. If World lasts a decade as the primary Mario Kart game, even very casual users will likely rack up dozens of hours, and because it's a multiplayer experience, it entertains multiple people at once. But I think another reason is that Nintendo knows that it's positioning Donkey Kong to hopefully reach a new market. They dropped the price of Metroid Prime Remastered in a similar manner when, quite frankly, most of its fanbase was so ecstatic that they could easily have charged the full $60 with only a fraction of the fuss generated by the Mario Kart price. But Metroid Prime is a bubble franchise and the game was positioned to try to tempt people in. Dread was full price, but then again, Dread had a demo. So, I think it was always the approach to try to bring people into Donkey Kong with a slightly lower price, even though it's still a prestige game, but then to strike while the hype cycle is hot and to upsell people on DLC, which, let's face it, was probably broken off the original game sometime during the planning and development. Why now then? Well, look, at the moment, Donkey Kong Bonanza is one of the relatively few big games on the Switch 2, and it has a high chance of being sold in significant numbers until the end of December. If some of those people finish it over Christmas and want a little bit more, why a relatively inexpensive add-on might be a quite tempting when purchased. Also, if the game does receive some Game Awards hype, the presence of a DLC pack might also encourage those who previously experienced the game to revisit it. Long term, there is the potential as well for a relatively low cost DLC to be put onto the Nintendo Switch Online expansion pack, in the same way that Octo Expansion was, potentially encouraging some people who have the expansion pack to jump onto the game since they already have the additional title, and in general making the expansion pack seem more valuable going forward, as this is a major source of Nintendo's stable income now. As for the demo, the question may be, why do a demo on day 57 and not day 1? Well, creating a demo does take some time, and for a game releasing 6 weeks into a console's life, there's really no need to communicate that weakness by suggesting your second ever major title is a try before you buy affair. But the early adopters have now weighed in, and I suspect bought with a fairly decent attach rate all the same. Now is the time, therefore, for a second bite of the cherry. Now is the time to try to capture those people who were not convinced with the first wave. This coincides with what seems to be a very quiet month for Nintendo. I haven't particularly been persuaded by rumours of Metroid Prime 4 being delayed up until now, not because it's not plausible speculation, but simply because I couldn't see that there was any way of identifying whether or not this was in any way accurate. But while Dragon Drive and Kirby in the Forgotten Land fill the gaps, the fact is that there is no major original Switch 2 title between Donkey Kong Bonanza and the Nintendo Switch 2 edition of Pokemon Legends ZA, itself a cross-gen title. I just can't imagine this was ever Plan A. If we think back to 2017, Nintendo dropped the Champions Ballad DLC to sync in with the Game Awards, and I could have seen this as a sensible time to be able, at least, to bring out Donkey Kong DLC. But if Metroid Prime 4 required extra time, then having Donkey Kong DLC in the month of September would be an effective way to bridge the gap. All of which to say, while I think it's perfectly plausible that they were concerned by Donkey Kong Bonanza's numbers, I also think that this may already be part of a long-term strategy for Donkey Kong, even if the specific details of exactly what they did when were changed, and therefore it may not be a reflection of Donkey Kong that the DLC was dropped when and how it was. The fact is, even the early numbers for Donkey Kong Bonanza, which we will see in due course, won't really give us that much of an insight into how successful the franchise will be over the course of the Switch 2's life, as that rests on it becoming an evergreen seller. It will depend on things like the game's competition and their ability to continue to promote it, notably through the films and theme parks and offers, and probably more other initiatives over the coming years. At some point, I do plan to revisit an overview of the Donkey Kong franchise, as an awful lot has changed in the period of time since I last looked at it. For now, though, thanks so much for watching, and I shall see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.